You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week on the podcast, we're back at last fall's virtual Railvolution conference. Former BART GM Grace Crunican moderates a panel discussing the role of board members in transit agencies, with Boston's Monica Tibbits-Nutt and Houston's Christof Spieler. Stay with us. Today's podcast was produced in partnership with Railvolution. To find out more about next year's conference in Miami or the National Learning Network, visit railvolution.org. That's railvolution.org. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super generous, amazing Patreon supporters. It's 2022, and we're celebrating 8 years of the Talking Headways podcast. So to join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $10 a month will still get you a bus-only scarf. I promise I'm still working on new designs and formats. $2 a month will get you stickers and a handwritten note, but any support is welcome and much appreciated. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Today's podcast is also brought to you by the projects of The Overhead Wire. Whether it's our daily newsletter first established in 2006 or our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic Town Planning and Practice, find out more today at theoverheadwire.com.
Former General Manager of BART, and I'll be your moderator today, and I'd like to introduce our two panelists. Christof Spieler, he is the Vice President and Director of Planning for Hewitt Solars. He teaches at Rice University, and he has served on the board of Houston Metro. He's done some interesting things there with the Houston Metro team. Also with us is Monica Tibbits-Nutt, who is the Executive Director of the 128 Business Council. She works in transportation planning, urban design, and equity, and she's just stepping down as a member of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Board of Directors. So we have some very experienced people with us. And we're going to start off just basically with some questions about the board's role and membership. And I want to just tip it to you, Monica, maybe just to talk about what you think the role is of a board in and give us some experience in making public policy decisions.
Well, serving on the MBTA Board of Directors and serving on the Department of Transportation for Massachusetts, both of those boards was very unusual. The MBTA board, there were only 5 of us. Each of us were appointed by the governor as subject matter experts. And since we were meeting 3 to 4 times a month, to make it to where all 5 of us would actually be able to have input, we kind of had all of our separate areas. And then each board member would go through, work with those departments, work on those projects, and then share it with the other 4 members. Having that many board meetings made it very difficult for staff. It made it very difficult for the general manager. And while I think we heard from the public, we heard from different constituent groups, different municipalities, that they really enjoyed it because they were able to keep up with quite honestly, down to very detailed daily minutia. They were able to understand how the agency worked. And I think the place that the MBTA was in at the beginning of that particular board 6 years ago was a place where we were having a lot of delays. We were having incidents on the system. And I think for the public, that was needed. After 6 years, there is a shift and there's going to be a new board because I think that board was perfect for that time. But now that we've come through that, now that we have all these lessons learned, it's not a time to transition to a different type of governance structure. And so I'm looking forward to that. I think it is much more sensitive to the staff and the general manager. And I think with them only meeting once a month, it actually gives staff and the agency time to do the job before the board has to weigh in. And so It is. It's like you're not as involved in the daily workings. And I think that is incredibly important once you get through kind of whatever crises you're dealing with, which is how our board, the 5-member 6-year board was created, was out of the crisis of being hit by 2 snowstorms in 2015 where the system came to a standstill. So I think those are kind of the differences for us in how the boards were structured.
So I'm going to get to Christof in just a minute, but you think if you hadn't had that transparency problem, or you said people wanted to climb in and get to every level of detail, if you hadn't had that problem, is that the level you think that you should be working at?
No. If the agency wasn't in the position that it was in 2015, the 5 of us wouldn't have needed to exist in the way that we did. But like I said, it was a time period and then we were to go away. And so I think the way we weighed in on policy worked at that time. but I don't think that that is a durable way to govern any agency.
No kidding. It sounds horrid to me. But Christof.
Yeah, no, and it's funny because my own board experience also started with a different kind of, it's Houston, it wasn't a snowstorm crisis, but we had a moment where the agency had lost a lot of trust with the public. New mayor came in, knew they wanted to replace the general manager, put a new board in place, and we had this immediate sort of, there was a perception of crisis around the agency, there was a perception of scandal around the agency, there was a perception that the agency had needed to rebuild relationships and needed to rebuild financially, including the fact that had started construction on a set of rail lines that were based on FTA funding without having a federal funding agreement in place. So we were effectively had a project that we couldn't complete without federal dollars, and the feds had not actually committed to giving us those dollars. So there was this, and mind you, a Buy America investigation around the procurement of some new rail cars. So there was this like true crisis moment that we came into. And then I think that ended up setting some of the tone of the board. And I think like you can really see how different boards have different tones. And part of the way I came to think about it is I think there's a couple of things a board does. One is a sort of financial oversight and accountability function. This is why boards approve contracts. This is why boards approve annual budgets. And sometimes that ends up being the dominant function for a while, depending on how well run the agency is perceived as being. I think the second function, which is, I think, often not given nearly enough weight, is a board is a place to really hammer out policy. I think a board is a place where a transit agency can have discussions that are better had in public and can take advantage of the fact that board members can say things that staff can't. That if you leverage that dynamic well, you can have really meaningful policy discussions at a board level in a way that the staff by themselves could not do them. And finally, I think a board is a kind of conduit between an agency and the public. A board is somebody whose stakeholders can come to as a way of accessing the agency. Board members can be ambassadors of the agencies to the public, again, in a way that the staff isn't. And I think we often, first of all, different boards are different in that balance, but I also think we often get the balance wrong. When I look at boards I've worked with, when I look at board agendas I dealt with, I feel like boards tend to often spend way too much time on routine issues and often fairly minuscule issues, while not spending nearly enough time on the big questions that transit agency is confronting, on really having those big picture policy discussions.
So I think of the budget as a policy document in a lot of ways. Is the budget one of those things you think they spend too much time on?
Now, it depends how you're talking about a budget. And I think this is something that Houston Metro got a lot better at in my time on the board. But do you actually present a budget as a policy document? Or do you present a budget as a spreadsheet? And what kind of discussion are you going to have around that budget? You can spend hours talking about a budget without ever talking about the underlying policy things you just raised, which goes to the point of both the staff and the board have a responsibility in how they frame these discussions. If you start a staff's budget presentation to the board by simply running down the numbers, here's our dollars of assets, and here's how that changed last year, and here's our budget divide in capital and operating, then you aren't going to have a policy discussion. You're going to have a discussion about why did this item go up by $2 million. If instead you say, here are our big priorities as an agency, this is how we decided on those priorities, this is how the budget reflects those priorities, then you're going to end up having a policy discussion.
And you're both in agreement that the policy is where the board's attention should spend. That's what you should be focused on?
Depends on the board. You know, we were called the Fiscal and Management Control Board. And so for us, the financials were a really, really big part of what we did. But like I said, we're a very unusual board. And I agree with Christof. A lot of the time when it comes to the financials, depending on the board, but for us, spreadsheets. That's all it was. It was spreadsheets, revenue, where our losses were, thinking about all of that. And then the policy discussions were completely separate. And I do consider a budget as a strategic plan, but the way it was set up at the agency and the way it's still set up does not reflect that.
All right, let's get into some substance and see how you handle this. We've talked a little bit about at Revolution about the role of transit in equity, the issues of equity and who we serve. And we are certainly at the heart of a community. When you think about your housing and how you get to work and how you get to school and stuff like that, housing and transportation, those are two key parts of your life that can be a real time and money suck if you don't have, you're not well put together in terms of housing and transportation. So how do you see the role of a board of transit agencies in that discussion? And what is it you think we can do at the local level to help address the issues of equity and the relationship with housing, which I think is very much tied in transit to, that's my assumption, maybe you'd like to disagree with that, to transit and housing.
Yeah, I mean, I think transit boards need to play a really big part in this. I think, unfortunately, when you're talking about agencies, and honestly, when you're talking a lot about our industry, only more recently have we started talking about equity. And I think a lot of that came out from the social protests throughout the United States. But prior to that, there has not been a conversation in transit about equity unless it was coming from outside of the agency. And so I think with the board, depending on the board, but for me, it was pushing moving beyond our diversity and equity initiatives, moving beyond just reporting the statistics about how many people of color were at the agency, but actually having the discussion about the failures internally so that we can actually start addressing the failures externally. Because anyone that works in our industry knows every time we build a rail line, we displace people. Every single time we build an extension, you take, communities that as middle income, you were able to actually buy a house, put your kids in a great public school. The second you start putting in those rail lines, then you're talking $750,000 studios. So everywhere you go to try and improve transit, you're displacing everyone that you were planning on serving. And so not only does it make no sense, but you're just throwing money out there under the guise of improving service while actually making the quality of people's lives worse. And I think that transit housing link is not discussed enough, and it is not planned for. Because if you're not thinking about these things, you can't talk about transit-oriented development. You can't take on the zoning issues that keep a lot of these transit-oriented developments from happening. It avoids all of the really hard stuff while saying that equity matters. And so I do think we have to move beyond just these initiatives, just writing mission statements, and actually start making a difference within the industry as a whole.
Christof, I'm not going to say I subscribe to everything Monica says as absolutes, that every project has done this, but let's say it does for now. And I want to make sure you guys get to the role the board plays, and then you can get to some of those details as to how you do that. Because Monica, you're on the board. Christof, you're on the board. I mean, you were. How do you recommend board members get involved and get these issues before it? Detailed, the how-tos.
Well, I mean, a couple things there. First of all, when we're building a transit project, we should actually have an explicit discussion about what is our goal of this project. Like I feel like way too often capital projects are presented as concrete. Like, we are building 10 more miles of rail. We are building a new transit center, rather than talking about what is the purpose of this transit center? Why did we decide to spend money in this particular space? And what is our belief in how this will improve people's lives? And if we have that discussion, it can often lead to us making much better decisions around the project. And some of those decisions are going to go outside of what an agency is usually comfortable with. Like, agencies know how to pour concrete. Agencies know how to schedule bus service. Agencies don't know how to do affordable housing policy, but we got no choice. We have to think about those issues, and we have to think about issues that go beyond sort of the organizational footprint of the agency, which means we got to work with other agencies, which gets really hard.
Okay, so stop for just a minute. Do you have, when you were at Houston Metro, did you pass an affordable housing policy?
We didn't, and that was one of the true frustrations in Houston. Now, I'll say the issues in Houston are somewhat different. This is something which is different by metro area. Houston isn't in the same kind of housing crisis that a lot of the rest of the country have, but it's sort of sneaking up on us. I would say in Houston, historically, nobody was really having housing discussions. The city and the county weren't either. And that's really been a new thing that just over the last couple of years, those discussions have started boiling to the surface. And you're starting to see sort of the transit agency engage, but it's tough too, because you have to realize a lot of the political dynamics here. I mean, we all know how contentious housing policy is. I mean, a lot of what's happening in this country is we're trying to use transit agencies to solve housing problems. I mean, the San Francisco Bay Area is all about not building housing in the right places and then expecting transit systems to adjust to the fact when people are moving further and further away from the core because the core has become utterly unaffordable because the people who live there won't allow more housing to be built there.
Well, I do want to. BART did have an affordable housing policy. I mean, we 30%. Anything at the stations were required to have 30%. We put the RFPs out in that fashion. We made sure it was a requirement, and I think they are trying to. We were trying to retrofit BART anyway, and that was part of my discussion with Monica. I think that there is a way to tie your housing requirement to the project you're about to put out there. I think I didn't go into details about the issues, but at MBTA, do you have an affordable housing policy at the T?
No, we don't. And a lot of staff has spent a long time working with the Department of Transportation, working with the municipalities to try and move something like that forward. But here in Massachusetts, our inner core communities, and even outside of that, you're talking communities that minimum housing prices are approaching $1 million. And so we are at a crisis, and we have been for a very long time, and our transit agency is not responding to that. Through projects like the bus network redesign, through projects like the rail vision at the agency, they are trying to address that. But until there's some sort of connection, the land use varies by every municipality. The MBTA serves 182 municipalities. So you can see how difficult that is. And doing the transit-oriented development really is the only way to try to affect that housing policy from within the agency.
So let's follow that, because both of you have been involved at changing the bus service that's provided in order to make sure that it better serves the people that are transit dependent. Is that not correct?
Yes.
So you took a policy, you're on the board, you got a particular philosophy, and you're trying to change the policy to address the equity issue. What steps did you take? Let's say we've got thousands of board members watching this broadcast, and they're trying to figure out how they can implement change. So we'll use this as the example. How did you do it? How'd you go about doing it?
So step number one is actually change what we're talking about. Put something on the agenda. I think our bus network as a whole, and in particular the structure of the network, the actual route structure, were something that had been taken for granted forever. Metro was and still is really good at operating buses. The ops people were great. But essentially, the bus system itself was never really a topic for discussion. So, number one, job as a board members should be setting the agenda, just like general manager should be setting the agenda for.
How do you get on the agenda?
We need to be talking about.
How do you get on the agenda? Because, and I mean, figuratively is nice, but literally at BART, you have to have, if the general manager and the president don't want to put it on the agenda, and you're a board member that's not the president that year, you have to get 3 other votes to do it, or you got to get the general manager or the board person. How do you get it on it? Did you just raise the issue and say, I'd like this item on, and everyone said, oh yeah, let's go?
You're right. I was talking about sort of the metaphorical agenda. So what did I do? Number one, be the voice out there in the community. Talk to people out there about how do we make transit better, get local advocates, get community groups interested in these issues. And way before we actually started a formal process of bus network redesign, I and others were out there in the community talking about why we thought this was necessary. So there'll be outside support.
Were you doing it without the general managers or the agency's knowledge? Did you go to community meetings, so you got a constituency going?
I wasn't hiding it from them. But I was at meetings, and I would say I'm 1 vote out of 9. I am not speaking for the agency. And I would be very clear that I was not speaking for the agency. And I think that's actually a powerful thing a board member can do. The next thing I did, really at the same time, is talk to the staff and go through the CEO to have those meetings, but really talk to the staff about what do we need to do. What I discovered is a lot of the best ideas were already there. They were already circulating at the level of the planning and scheduling department. They just hadn't bubbled up. And I realized that part of my job as a board member was to help those issues bubble up. And then the other thing is, I mean, the most powerful thing a board member can do in a lot of ways isn't vote, it's ask questions. And that includes both in those private meetings, but it includes at the board meeting. What questions do you ask on each item that's on the agenda? And if they brief you on this is what this month's bus ridership was, start digging into that. Have that discussion. And I discovered really quickly that, like, literally sitting at the horseshoe with a microphone in front of me was one of the most useful things I could do. Just what we talked about at that horseshoe ended up shaping agency discussion. So a lot of times it wasn't
The
formally
horseshoe
on
is the
the
board
agenda.
meeting.
Yeah,
The horseshoe
literally
is the
that
board
big
meeting.
table
Yeah.
that we're sitting at, and that we were live streaming, and that the media was watching.
Okay, so just to summarize before we pivot, you got a constituency from the outside. You started going to neighborhood groups or local community meetings of some kind. You talked to the staff with the general manager, the staff to find the idea. And then at the podium, when the budget came up, you asked your question. When this other topic came up, you asked your questions to kind of get the issue out on the table. Are those 3 steps you took?
3
Monica.
really important steps.
Monica, how about you?
Our board set the agenda. The general manager would put things on if we need to vote on contracts or he needed specific feedback on something. But every single week, all 5 of us wait and we look at the schedule, and this was in public. And I would be like, okay, I want presentations on this project, this project, this project. And then it would go onto the agenda. And usually it was raising that, talking to the staff to see when do you have time to be able to make this presentation and going from there. In addition to what Christof said, going out into the public, talking to our elected officials, we also took in a lot of feedback. So I would get emails from groups. I get emails from individuals, tweets, all of these different things. And I would go through it and I would work with the staff to, if I had questions, to answer it. And then the same with staff. They could reach out, listen, we're working on this project. We need to get before the board. And then I would just put them before the board. So it was a lot of different interactions in many different channels that set what we thought was important to discuss in public with that appropriate staff.
So in Houston, Houston goes, from New York to California. It's a very big city.
Yes.
It's a broad geographic area. In BART, we had, I think, 33 different jurisdictions when you count the cities and the counties. When you're trying to deal with equity, and Monica noted this earlier, you've got to deal with the cities and the jurisdictions, the municipalities that you run through, and the land use policies of those areas. And some of those cities and municipalities have policies that say, yay, affordable housing, we're going to put you here, this is how we're going to address it. And some of them have policies that don't say we don't want you, but that's what they say, that we don't want you here. And if you need affordable housing, please go outside. I won't even name the cities, but so you have 2 different kind of, there's lots of jurisdictions that the T runs through. But whose role is it to talk to the mayor and the county, or the head of the municipality and the counties to talk about these issues? Because we had in California, as I said, 33 different jurisdictions I think BART ran through. Whose job is that? The board members, the staff? Do you try and make a stand and get 3 or 4 areas to address it? Or you try and do uniform policies? Do you appeal to the governor? What do you do as a board member?
I mean, I think as a board member, appealing to leadership at the agency, working with them to figure out how they're communicating with the municipalities, being responsive to the municipalities who reach out directly, and then trying to put together some suggestions, which for here in Massachusetts goes to the legislature because the board was legislatively mandated, and to the administration through the Secretary of Transportation. So there are many different ways we had to do it. But I think, once again, we're in a very unique situation here in Massachusetts where none of the inner core communities want to build any housing, much less affordable housing. So it's already a contentious relationship from the beginning, and that relationship structure changed depending on the project and which communities it was going to be in. Where you're talking about the marginalized groups, a lot of the time it's the board working directly with those people or individual staff members working directly with those neighborhoods. And then for the board and staff, it's then bringing it back to the agency to start having more of these discussions about more specific communities.
Let's go back a step. We've been talking now about the affordable housing and trying to get new in, and that's with new projects to a large extent. If you're going to put a new line someplace, making sure you've got them at the stations is important. But the interesting thing the 2 of you did was you changed the bus structure. You changed the bus structure to respond to where the people are. And it's my understanding, at least in Houston, when COVID hit, there was actually still an increase in ridership in those areas that were transit dependent, and you had put transit there to stay. Am I right on that, Christof?
Yeah, I mean, we saw the same thing we saw in Houston in we saw across the country, which is a lot of the routes that people really depended on for all of their daily trips, not the 9 to 5 white collar commute routes, but those routes, the ridership stayed. And we really, again, it's sort of, we had the discussion about what are we trying to accomplish with this bus network redesign. And one of the things we really focused on was we are trying to make current transit riders' trips better. And I think that was, again, something really important to articulate. It was one of those things where part of your job as a board is for people to actually believe you, that you need to have that credibility in the community, that when you say, this is why we're doing what we're doing, they actually believe that that's your actual motivation. And again, I think that's part of the reason for having these discussions, and it's part of the reason for board members being vocal parts of them. I think what the earlier discussion triggered in me too is part of what a good board can do is actually be a sort of backbone to the staff. That what I see all too often is a dynamic where a board wants something in principle. Like, we want affordable housing next to our stations, and they tell the staff we want affordable housing next to our stations, and the staff prepares a proposal, does exactly that. Proposal goes out there, and the local city council members get upset, like, this is too dense, and then the board turns around and immediately looks at the staff and said, what were you idiots doing putting this proposal out there? It's really important as board members to actually be consistent about that. So, like, part of the dealing with municipalities is actually the board and the staff sitting down and saying, here are the principles of how we are going to deal with these issues. Here are how we are going to respond. And for the board to make it clear to the staff that we will actually back you up if you follow these principles. We aren't going to back down. We aren't going to leave you standing on the plank out by yourself. We are going to back you up if you follow through on the policies we've discussed, and if you approach these issues the way we've discussed them. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing, because I think board members often have the ability to sort of push back in a way that the staff can.
Absolutely. I think you started this whole thing by the premise of the policy, though, and I think that's what's really important for board members that are out there. If you've got adopted board policies, it makes it easier for the staff to follow and make tough decisions. And then you're exactly right. When people come around to then question, hey, wait a minute, that means we're going to have this or that happen at this station, and they start to question it, then you've got some board members to stand up and say, no, we need to take some of that heat. This is part of an overall policy. We aired the policies, we had that discussion in public, and now we're implementing them.
The other, like, one of the things that really, the protests after the murder of George Floyd, watching that play out and watching the discussion play out, I think there are some really difficult discussions we have to have that are going to be really uncomfortable for people. Like, right. I am deeply convinced that a lot of the current structure of the transit industry, of the systems we operate, of the agencies we are in, is based on racism. Not in a way that the current people who are the current stewards of those agencies are deliberately being racist, but even the way governance patterns were formed. You look at Atlanta and ask which counties are in MARTA and which aren't. The way station locations were chosen, the BART planners in the 1970s, why did they not put a station in the densest part of Oakland? Like, we know those motivations, and we've sort of inherited systems that are full of that. And we are never going to get better unless we are willing to take that on head on, to actually have honest discussions about, this is the truth of the systems we have. This is the truth of the policies we have been following, of even little things like, what are the standards for bus stops compared to rail stations? And say, we have gotten this wrong and we need to do this better, and be ready to take that pushback. I mean, be ready that when that pushback comes on, that housing is too dense that you are proposing in your station, be ready to give, why are you against low-income housing? And actually be willing to have honest discussions about the inequities in our world, rather than pretending they don't exist, or rather than trying to have a polite discussion around them. And again, that's something that board members can do. That's something that board members can play a really powerful role in, and something that staff by themselves are often in a much more difficult position to do.
So let's talk about where the board members come from in the first place, because if you're going to have that discussion, you're feeling empowered to do that. How did you get on the board at Houston Metro? How did you get the appointment?
Yeah, so I was a mayoral appointment, and this is a really important discussion of how do people end up on boards. I was a mayoral appointment. I was unusual as a mayoral appointment in two ways. One is I got on the board not really by being politically connected, but by being in the transit advocacy world. I literally wrote a blog about transit that led to me being named to a transit board. And we had a mayor, Anise Parker, who was a policy wonk herself and appreciated the policy wonkiness. The second is I got named to the board partially because I was actually a daily transit rider, which doesn't sound radical, but it is actually on U.S. transit boards. Even in places like New York City, you have transit board members who don't ride transit. And so both of those things made me very unusual as a board member, I would say. And often when you look at boards, you see sort of appointments are, here are people who are political up-and-comers, here are people who have a relationship with the mayor, those kind of appointments. And that can make boards really hard. And I think a good board is people who, number one, really care about the agency, who don't see this as a stepping stone to their next thing, but number two, bring a real competency. And that doesn't have to be transit. I really appreciated the lawyers on the board. I really appreciate the financial people on the board. When we had discussions about issuing bonds, I was really glad the financial people were there. But I actually think that a lot of times the people who appoint boards do not really appreciate how much of a difference they can make with the right board appointments. And I also think that a lot of the people out there in the community who care about transit don't really realize that they themselves could be a board member, and that may be something to aspire to. Ultimately, I became a board member because, I emailed a couple people who I knew were in these discussions and said, this is something I'd be interested in. And I'm really glad I did that.
Monica, how did you get on your board?
I don't know. That's a question I think a lot of people have asked after I was appointed. I was appointed by the governor. I had never met the governor before. I was not politically connected. I am a transportation and community planner. So I had been doing a lot of this work. I've been working with a lot of advocacy groups. I've been working with a lot of municipalities on trying to make their transportation better, working in partnership with our transit agency. But for me, it was really, I know how systems operate. I run a private shuttle service that is privately funded, available to the public every day. That's my job. And so I had a lot of this background. And quite honestly, I'm also a person of color. I'm a person of color who's very upfront about that. And then the same thing Christof said, the reason I've gotten along well with the public, I'm a daily transportation user. I use transit every day. I'm a bus rider predominantly. And so I think also bringing that unique perspective, because we did not have that on the board.
So your board is appointed, let's back up. Peter Rogoff, a former FTA administrator, is famous for saying, if you've seen one transit agency, you've seen one transit agency, because they're all very unique. They've been designed at different points in time. They're constructed based on the politics of the area. Some are appointed by the mayor and a couple county commissioners. Some are appointed by the governor, some a mix. In BART, they're directly elected by the public. So there's a whole mix that's out there. Monica, your board is very unique in that all of the appointments are by the governor. Is that correct?
Yes.
So new governor, new set of appointments. Is that correct?
Usually here depends on the governor. A lot of times governor will come in and just wipe everything out and start a new board, probably hire a new general manager. But occasionally there are some holdovers, and they usually happen to be the ones, like Christof said, around the financials. People who deal with the finance, people who deal with retirement and things like that. They tend to hang over, but for the most part, it changes over.
So he went into some detail about trying to get policy changes and advocating policy changes. So the first thing is your authority to be there. And then it's also your colleagues and what they're interested in. At BART, they're geographic representations that are there. Sometimes appointments are made by professional diversity, as you were referencing, the lawyers and accountants and that sort of thing. Where do you take the involvement with your policy board members in terms of differences when you have, if a governor has come in and appointed everybody, they take some responsibility that they have a specific message. But if not, if there's competing interests, maybe rural county interests and urban interests, where do you go with that? How do you deal with your anti-colleagues, the anti-your position?
I mean, I think for us, there were only 5 of us, and we come from a complete political spectrum. That's the other thing about the appointments here. Since there are 5 of us, there had to be 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 unenrolled. So you have that balance there. Geography, we're from all over the Commonwealth, so we had those differences. The big thing for us, we were all very respectful with each other and actually got along well. We had our arguments in public. They were respectful arguments, but we argued those out in front of everyone. So they got to see why I was taking a particular stance. They got to see why my colleague was taking a particular stance. And then between that, we usually just came to some sort of collaboration or some sort of negotiation, but the public got to see all of that. And so I do think it made it much more civil, but I also think we were just dealing with 5 people who cared enough to dedicate that kind of time. So we didn't shut down each other's ideas. We just tended to try and find some mix of what our stance was with the other 4 members.
Christof?
Yeah, we had some moments of sort of extreme tug of war. But I think as board members, we realized that in those moments, that was a larger political fight that was playing out on the board, but that was in a lot of ways happening above our heads. And that didn't prevent us from working together on the things that weren't embroiled in that fight. And those moments will always happen on transit boards. And I think there is a basic, like that basic respect matters. But I really want to back up what Monica said too, which is explaining publicly why you are voting the way you do, explaining disagreements and actually trying to get at the core of that disagreement. Probably the most important vote I ever took on the board was an 8-1 vote where I was the one vote against. It was a proposition we were putting on the ballot, and I didn't believe it was worded in a way that was really, fair to the voters. And the board chair knew I was going to be voting against in advance. I didn't blindside anybody, and I explained why I voted the way I did, and I left it at that, too. I didn't sort of try to undermine the decision once it got made, because the decision had been made. I think the public appreciates that kind of transparency, that the public realizes that these things are not always going to be unanimous. And if we actually show publicly where the tensions are and why we're making the decisions we are, I think there's a lot of transit agencies are convinced that unanimous votes are somehow important publicly, that it looks better for the agency if all the votes. I think it looks worse for the agency. When I've seen agencies that are really dedicated, like I've watched New York transit governance, and what's happened in New York is the decisions all get made way before they come to the board, and then the board is just transparently like play acting out the decision after it's gotten made. And I don't think the public appreciates that. I think the public actually wants to understand how the decisions are being made.
So first, did the measure pass, the one you opposed?
It did.
Okay. So the other thing you're advocating for is civil discourse, is people actually having disagreements and taking them in public and actually trying to make government work. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
You want to make this recommendation to Congress? Shall we pause for a minute and everyone can write their congressional? All right. Let's we've talked about equity. And in the background, equity is also, it's not just the racial issues, which Christof noted we should take forward. And certainly that can be brought up again here. But we've got, at least on the West Coast, the issue of homelessness. It affects all races. And but if you're talking all the way from Vancouver down to San Diego, we have huge homelessness problems, which is a huge problem for transit agencies. Whether you force collection of the money at the front of the bus at the beginning of the trip, the end of the trip, you have station, you have automatic gates, whatever it is, everyone has a problem with homelessness at the stations, underneath the infrastructure, on the cars, in the bus itself. As transit board members, you've seen some of that. What recommendations do you have on how to approach that? And what recommendations do you think transit agency, or what steps should they take to try and get that discussion on the table and get at some solutions?
I mean, I think having the discussion independent of safety. Safety is incredibly important. We've had a number of times where operators, station staff have interactions, particularly with people who had substance abuse problems or were struggling with mental issues, having physical confrontations with the frontline staff, having physical confrontations with passengers. That, for the most part, and it's really what I see in a lot of different areas and different agencies, that's where the discussion of homelessness is. That's kind of where it lives. or when talking about, okay, in the winter, which stations are going to be allowing homeless people in. We have really nasty weather here, so that plays out a lot here. But as far as having any discussions about how can we better be serving the populations, how can we work with the homeless community to provide better services, how can we work with social workers around providing more transit services for that population, those discussions aren't had. And I think as long as we continue to have these discussions in just that safety standpoint, and really safety not for the homeless population, but just safety for everyone else, we're not going to be able to actually address any of these issues. And we play a massive part in this because every social issue is on our transit systems and it's amplified on our transit systems. But I don't see our industry taking on homelessness at all.
Yeah. No, and I think fundamentally the people most affected by homelessness are the homeless, and fundamentally the solution to homelessness is housing, which means we have an issue here which goes beyond what transit agencies can do. And again, that goes to one thing board members can do, which is be involved in these larger policy discussions. I think secondly, your underlining of that safety thing, it's almost like there's two kinds of safety discussions we have on transit. One is legitimate safety discussions, and there are legitimate safety issues on transit. I mean, I've been in some really good discussions about sexual harassment on transit, and I know that is a very real thing and something that transit agencies need to take much more seriously than they have before. But sometimes the safety discussions we have is what like Dr. Destiny Thomas would call essentially white comfort discussions. Is this an actual safety discussion? Or is this a question of people not being comfortable being on the same train as people who don't look like them, or being on the same bus as people who don't look like them? And frankly, oftentimes that's when we're having a safety discussion, that's what it is. We're not talking about actual crime. We're not talking about actual assaults. We're talking about there's a homeless guy on the bus. And they are residents of our cities as much as anyone else, and they have a right to be on the bus as much as anyone else. And what I've really appreciated is the agencies that have moved beyond sort of police as a response to homelessness. In other words, solving a housing problem as if it were a crime problem, to dealing with it as a social services problem, which it is. And transit boards can either be a really productive part of that discussion, or transit boards can play into the kind of this is a crime problem narrative. And I think that's where board members have to be really careful about which of those discussions they want to have.
So I'm going to just play the other side, not because I particularly believe it, but I want to play it out for you, okay? The safety issue, when you talk about white comfort, okay, as an example, right. I had riders come to me saying, look, I paid $7.50 for this ride. And when they did a fare inspection, this gentleman paid nothing. Okay. And he slept on the car and he smelled up the car. And so the rest of us were smushed into these other cars. So this person could sleep 20 miles in on the train from suburb X. And the issue that's also starting to brew is let's have free transit. Okay. Let's reduce the transit fares that are out there. So I think there's some element of white comfort, just as you said. There's also some element of when you say he has a right to be on this car, if someone paid $7.50 and someone else didn't, we either need to change the policies of the fare system so we have a subsidy that we provide for people who don't have the means to use transit, and we need to provide adequate housing, which the transit agency has, I think, role as a community member. But we don't have all the solutions in the transit bucket, and this goes back to our earlier discussion of housing itself. In BART's case, we had land around the stations. So we started to work with the providers of public housing to see what we could do with them to provide what could the transit agency do to make its contribution. But more often than not, I think all of these problems that we're dealing with today are problems that don't fall with any one agency's bailiwick. It's not just the housing provider. It's not just the transit agency. It's not just the other social service providers. It requires some combination of a solution to figure out, providing fare for folks if you don't have free transit zone. How as a board member can you help cause those discussions? Because if I had made the contributions Monica made, it sounded like she gave us her whole life for 6 years on these meetings, 6 board meetings or 4 board meetings a month, and all the prep time that goes into that. Who has the time? Who has the responsibility to do that other job of the integration in the transit world?
I mean, ultimately, the staff has a lot of responsibility here. Board members have a responsibility to create an agency that has a staff and that has a culture that can actually work out these issues. I do not want board members figuring out the details of how we do fare enforcement. And board members have a role in sort of asking the right questions. And I mean, like, one of the things that has always struck me on fare enforcement is, if we have fares, it makes sense that we enforce them in some way. Why is it that we treat transit fare enforcement so differently than we treat parking enforcement? You know, we aren't arresting people for overstaying a parking meter or for not feeding the meter. I've not seen videos of people wrestled to the ground by armed officers because they failed to pay a parking meter. Yeah. And I think, again, why do we treat that differently is because a lot of the motivation for how we do fare enforcement on transit actually has very little to do with fare enforcement. It has larger issues of class and race, and it's actually using fare enforcement as a way to sort of pretextual searches and everything else we do. Like, it's actually taking the discussion beyond the obvious discussion that's in front of us and asking the larger questions in the larger context. And frankly, I think we ought to have a discussion about why we charge transit fares. Because I think one of the most amazing things is, if you go around the industry and actually ask people, why do we charge fares? I think a lot of times there's no clear reason we can articulate as to why a given transit agency charges fares. Now, there's cases like BART where they're a huge part of the budget, which means if we're going to have a fare-free discussion, we should need to have a discussion about what replaces that funding. Yeah. But even there, I think it's legitimate to ask the question of what is the purpose of charging a transit fare? What are we trying to do by charging that fare? And I don't know that that discussion necessarily leads us to fare-free transit. Like, I tend to think that often the opportunity cost is such that we do low-income fares and keep other fares in place and spend that money instead to make service better, that's probably a better solution. But I think we should have the discussion. We shouldn't take for granted, and we should never say we charge fares because we've been charging fares for decades. We should be able to articulate why we actually do that.
I want to get to Monica on this very topic of fare-frees, but I want to inject that on the fare-free, on the issue of fare-free transit, it's oftentimes been a justification for those who want to spend no money on transit at all, that we do charge a fare, that it was incredibly, I've spent some time in my youth in Washington, D.C. doing the cost allocation studies, and Virginia's philosophy is much different than Maryland. So poor Metro, WMATA, had a tough time. I don't know if they figuring out different fare structure, because in Virginia, the theory was everyone should pay for themselves, pay for the whole ride if they could. And in Maryland, there was an assumed subsidy of some kind, and in the district, even greater. What if we were to go to fare free? Are there not some people nationally that would say this is the social program, and we don't want to pay for it, and start disinvesting in transit? That's the fear I have on that particular topic. But I'll put that out there. And Monica, why don't you talk about fare free transit and anything you've done to work that issue and your thoughts on it?
So I'm going to back up a little bit on the fare free. I think the fare free has just become this thing that we are throwing out there so we can actually have this real discussion about this. Because as Christof said, and I agree with Dr. Destiny Thomas, this is a white comfort situation. Here, the largest evaders of the fare are white collar people using the commuter rail. And they're not just avoiding paying $1.70, they're avoiding paying tens of dollars every time they don't pay a fare. But no police are going out on the commuter rail and arresting people. Whereas on our subway and bus system, you have police putting kids of color in handcuffs for evading $1.70 fare. And then being able to tack on additional fines and keep them from getting a driver's license. So the board stance on that, we went to the legislature with staff and we undid it because it was a ridiculous thing to have. But I think until there is an ownership of that, and going to what Christof said, actually talking about the data. Lots of people have anecdotes about this one time that thing happened, but what does the data actually say? And so in this situation here, we are prioritizing people over other people. And so then I think elected officials and advocacy groups are like, fine, let's talk about free fares, because we know who's going to be impacted the most by having to pay less. That is where I see that conversation. I don't agree necessarily with free fares. I agree with the reasoning for pushing that forward. I completely agree with it because only certain populations are being punished by this. And if no one can wrap their heads around that, then they are part of the problem.
I would also say, I think part of the reason why free fares have become such a big part of the discussion is number one, they're something that a lot of people intuitively understand. And number two, I think a lot of people in the political world are making the assumption that one of the biggest barriers for low-income residents using transit is the fare. And I think when transit agencies have actually had those discussions with their riders, the barriers we're hearing about is frequency. The barriers we're hearing about is reliability. The barriers we're hearing about is how close is that service to their house and the quality of the bus stops. And that goes to the point of like, where should we be investing? I think that in most networks, what would really help low-income riders is much better service.
Yes.
But it goes to, we as a transit agency have failed to articulate that. Like the reason why free fares have caught on to the degree they have is there's a vacuum out there. And I don't think the transit industry has actually articulated the alternative. The transit industry hasn't said, here's what we would do if we had more funding. And here's why it would make people's lives better.
I'd like to put out that I think part of this discussion, if you're a transit professional and you've made it all the way to general manager, generally speaking, you've been in administrative positions before and you've dealt with the infrastructure. And we now find ourselves maybe since 2015 or so, the problems of homelessness. I think lately, we're finally getting to the equity issue. We're dealing with racial disparity, racial injustice. We're putting some of those things on the table. And you have a group of professionals that are not trained in the social service area. I saw that in the homeless, when we started in on the homeless problem at BART in, say, 2016. And so having boards that provide the umbrella discussion, the umbrella policies framework, and as you talked about it, the backstop for the general manager is going to be very helpful. It also means, though, that the infrastructure people, if you will, the road and transit people, have to get into a subject area that they don't have necessarily the language for, the experience base. I find many of them willing to have the discussion, just not having the tools, if you will, to wade in. And that's where members of the public who are well positioned can help on that relationship and provide a broader framework for the discussion. Because in all cases, Christof, at least you, and I've seen Monica nod on this, have come back to what is the policy? What is the purpose? And you've both said, let's have an honest discussion about that. If the discussion is white comfort, let's not talk about fare free until we get through the basic of who are we trying to address. So it's having that honest discussion as a board member at the table. And it's tough to have these discussions as a society, let alone a general manager who's worrying about, the aging infrastructure that's out there and all these other things. So I think there can be a great relationship of help where they're willing to participate if there's some help from the board.
I think one of the things we actually do wrong a lot is we treat policy issues as if they were technical issues. We treat quality of service issues as if they were infrastructure issues. To me, one of the best examples is actually bus stop standards. Like, what should a typical bus stop look like? And I think most bus operating agencies are in a posture that essentially says, bus stop is an ADA pad and a sign, with very little information on the sign. And anything beyond that has to be justified by ridership. You want a shelter, you have to prove you have enough ridership at that. There's nothing about a bus that technically means that a bus doesn't need a shelter at every stop, whereas some of the same agencies, if they were to build a rail stop, they'd always put a shelter there. That's a policy decision of should every stop have a shelter or not. And I wish we had that. I wish we didn't just start from a standpoint of, this is our shelter, this is our shelter standard, and this is our technical standard for how we do bus shelters, but rather a standpoint of what do we feel the rider experience at a bus stop ought to be, and what should the minimum rider experience at a bus stop be, and what should we aspire towards? Let's have that discussion. And that obviously leads into a budget discussion, it leads into a technical discussion. But oftentimes we skip that and treat decisions that are about what kind of transit system we want to operate and what kind of system we want to be as if they were technical decisions when they're actually policy.
Well, it also leads into an equity decision, because if you take a highly used station and a not so highly used station and you go for a cleanliness standard, you're going to spend your time cleaning where there's more people than you are there. So your equity standard can be we clean once a month. That'll be horrid for some places. It would be adequate for some fairly far out places. The same thing of safety. How safe do you feel at a stop? How safe should you feel at a stop? Whose responsibility is it for you to feel safe? And what does that mean? What about the other people that are there? I mean, having those discussions makes it incredibly important to figure out the standards, and then you can start to translate as to how we get there. But not being afraid to have the discussion is one thing. Reserving the time with very busy board members and very busy board meetings is another tough call.
I saw there was a question in the chat about what really motivates a transit board into action from a community standpoint, and sort of how can the public engage with transit boards, which I thought was a really good question. And I'll say from my perspective, one of the things that really struck me as a board member is how few members of the public it took to change the discussion that was having at the board table and to put items onto the agenda. I mean, I remember in one case, we created a bus route because one public speaker showed up. And I think that's something the public and advocates often underestimate, just how little work it can take. I mean, not on the big political issues necessarily. You want to put a new tax in place. One person at the board won't do that. But a lot of the policy issues and a lot of the smaller decisions the transit agency makes, the public can actually be enormously effective. And reaching out to board members and coming to board meetings can be extraordinarily useful tool, especially if the board actually hears the voice of transit riders.
Monica, did you have people participate at the board, or was it a top-down governor says we're going to do it this way? How much could your board listen to the public?
Oh, as much as they wanted to tell us. Not only we had people who would come in, people who could send emails, voicemails. They, like I said, they would tweet at us. They would mail us things. And those were all ways that we took in information, and we made sure we shared it with other board members. As far as the administration bringing something down, the governor worked with the secretary. And if the secretary wanted to fight for something, that's one thing. But when it came to us as a board, we served the employees and we served the public. And I think having that frame of mind, especially for me, means that I am responsive to each of those riders. So if I'm going to the pharmacy and my pharmacist is like, this bus has been delayed for 6 weeks in a row. Well, now it's become an issue. And now I'm reaching out to staff to check in with that. But I think me and my fellow board members, we felt a responsibility to serve them.
How about, before we go, and we only have a minute left, I want to talk about the relationship between the staff, the employees, the workers, and the board. What responsibility do you have for the employees? You mentioned them, Monica. What responsibility do you have for the employees of the agency you're a board member to?
I think we had a ton of responsibility. One of the first things I did when I became a board member is I went to every garage. I went to the break rooms.
For you.
I went to lunches and let them just yell at me and tell me everything that we're doing wrong. And then it became this project where it's like, we need sofas in the break rooms. We need this in the break rooms. We need all of these things. That was the first thing I did. It was the thing I kept through for all 6 years because they are our internal customers. And our customer experience department that I started was internal and external. I think it's a huge responsibility because sometimes, especially for certain groups of people, the board may be all they have. They might not have a general manager to listen.
Christof.
Yeah, and operating a transit system is one of the hardest jobs in the world. The people who are out there driving the buses, the people who are out there maintaining the vehicles. Every time I got some insight into what it took to do that, I was in awe and realized that I myself would never be able to run a bus. And so I think having a humility and having an understanding that ultimately an agency has to put the buses and the trains out every day and everything that's behind that.
A big thank you to both of you. We're being cut off. Thank you. Thanks very much. We appreciate you being here, and thanks for the audience as well. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Kidways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and posted first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 15-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can listen to the show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find it its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Kidways.